Everybody is talking these days about Tammany men growing rich on graft, but nobody talks of drawing the distinction between honest graft and dishonest graft. There's all the difference in the world between the two. Yes, many of our men have grown rich in politics. I have myself. I've made a big fortune out of the game, and I'm getting richer every day. But I've not gone in for dishonest graft, blackmailing gamblers, saloon keepers, disorderly people, etc. And neither has any of the men who have made big fortunes in politics. There's an honest graft, and I'm an example of how it works. I might sum up the whole thing by saying, I seen my opportunities, and I took them. Well, that famous opening to the famous Plunket of Tammany Hall came to my mind this week when I was reading a Sixth Circuit case we will discuss about how some things in politics never change and the machinations of big city politics in America. However, the line between what's graft or bribery or what have you and what's just politics or maybe what's protected by the First Amendment has never been hard or never been all that easy to pin down. And we'll discuss that this week. Plus, is an iPhone search a search? On Short Circuit, your podcast on the Federal Courts of Appeals. I'm your host, Anthony Sanders, director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice. We're recording this on Tuesday, February 25th, 2025, and I have two of my Institute for Justice colleagues with me today. Paul Sherman, our resident graft and First Amendment expert, will be discussing this case from the Sixth Circuit, and then we will hear from Bobbi Taylor, who is going to be using her phone skills directed towards iPhones and searches. So, Bobbi, we'll hear from you in a little bit. We haven't had you on the show in a while. Your case is going to be from, I think it's Waterbury, am I saying that right, Connecticut?
Yes, Waterbury, Connecticut.
Kind of in your neck of the woods?
I went to law school in New Jersey, so it's kind of nearby.
Yeah, well, like to me out here in the Midwest, everything is just like the same thing out east. And it's like, you go 2 miles and you're in the next state. So we'll say that it's your area, but not his area. Paul Sherman, who hails from Florida way, he's going to discuss this case from the Sixth Circuit regarding politics in Cincinnati. Now, Paul, I believe you're going to have a little bit more sympathetic take on what happened to this fellow, and I do too. He's a city councilor in Cincinnati, and perhaps he was not in the same league as Boss Hogg at Tammany Hall.
No, I certainly think not. The case out of Cincinnati is United States of America versus Alexander Sittenfeld, a.k.a. PG Sittenfeld. And I'll just read the introduction to the case because I think it sets the stage nicely. It says, every day in this country, politicians solicit donations to finance their campaigns. And every day, these same politicians make statements about what they believe in, what they've done, and what they promise to do once elected. Sometimes, even often, these solicitations and promises occur in the same place at the same time. But though this speech and conduct are generally protected by the First Amendment, bribery remains illegal. When the bribery involves money flowing to a politician for his personal use, the crime is straightforward. But when a politician is accused of accepting campaign funds in exchange for the promise of official action, the line becomes blurrier. Still, the Supreme Court tells us there is a line, and Congress and the court have entrusted juries with discerning between legitimate campaign donations and illegitimate bribes. We must respect that line even in hard cases. This is one such case, which, first of all, that's a fantastic introduction to a judicial opinion. Really kind of grabs you and makes you want to see what's going on. What's going on in this case is that Mr. Sittenfeld is a city council member in Cincinnati. Soon he's going to be term limited out of the city council, so he wants to run for mayor, and he's soliciting contributions to do that. As he's going about that, he is approached by a gentleman whose name is Chinedum Ndukwe. but they call him Chin, or at least Sittenfeld called him Chin colloquially, and I'm going to do that too so I don't butcher his name any more than I already have.
I think that's fair.
So Chin reaches out to Sittenfeld about supporting his campaign, and Sittenfeld wants to get some money from him as he has gotten money from other developers. Sittenfeld has a reputation as being very pro-development, so developers want to see him as the mayor. And Chin has a particular project that he wants to see pushed forward. But unknown to Sittenfeld, Chin has been approached by the FBI because Chin was trying to violate campaign finance laws. He was caught sort of doing straw donations, trying to make donations in the names of other people. And unknown to Sittenfeld, he has become a confidential informant for the FBI, and he engages in a sting operation to catch candidates trying to engage in bribery. So Chin reaches out to Sittenfeld. They're talking about this particular development project, and Sittenfeld is trying to get a contribution. And then the question in the case is, did this cross the line into being an explicit quid pro quo? And as the introduction to the opinion suggests, it's an extremely important line because the Supreme Court has held that people do have a First Amendment right to solicit campaign contributions or to make campaign contributions, and that anything less than quid pro quo corruption can't be punished, or quid pro quo corruption, or in the campaign finance context, they say the appearance of quid pro quo corruption, which is its whole other set of problems. But in the bribery context, courts have been clear there has to be an explicit quid pro quo. So I'm going to read a little bit of the exchange between Chin and Sittenfeld, which was caught on a recording. And this was kind of like the pivotal statement that formed the basis of the jury's conviction. So the statement is, okay. So this is Sittenfeld. So just so you know, like, look, I have, I love what you do as someone revitalizing our city, creating jobs. I'm fond of you as a friend. I also have obligations to do the things I need to do to be a successful candidate. So, Chin, absolutely. Sittenfeld. So, but what I mean is, I don't really get if you say, look, I don't want to support you in the name of Chinedum and Dukwe, but some guy I've never met from Columbus is going to use a network. Are you going to round up a bunch of LLC checks? That's great. I actually don't care. But I mean, the one thing I will say is you don't want me to be like, hey, Chin, I love you, but can't, I want people to support me. That's the centerpiece of this prosecution. And if you understood it on the first reading, that's much more than I understood on the first reading. And one of the interesting things about it, so the pivotal line, the line that the court and the jury really focused on, was this line where Sittenfeld says, hey, Chin, I love you, but can't, right? And the prosecution's theory is that statement is an offer of an explicit quid pro quo. He's saying, look, I love you, but if you don't make this contribution to my campaign, I can't support this development project that you want to do.
Right.
And Sittenfeld is saying what it really meant was, I love you, but if I don't get reelected, I can't help you get this development project through. An interesting fact is that Sittenfeld had never voted against a development project. He was an extremely pro-development candidate. So I think that kind of undercuts the idea that there was a quid pro quo, that he would have actually voted against it. And in fact, he explicitly denied in a conversation with Chin that there could be a quid pro quo, actually using the words, there can't be any quid pro quo. And he explained, but I'm very pro-development. I've supported everything. I can get you the votes on the city council. Nevertheless, ultimately, the jury convicted him on counts under the Hobbs Act of bribery. And the question is, was there enough evidence to support that charge? There were other legal questions in the case, but I think this is kind of the most interesting question. And there are three opinions in the case. There's the majority opinion, which explains why it believes the jury's evidence is sufficient. There's a concurrence saying, I agree that under the law as it exists, this is a plausible reading of the federal bribery statute, and this was enough to convict. And that's actually kind of a problem because it seems like it's criminalizing a lot of ordinary politics and raising some First Amendment issues, but that's the law we have, so we have to deal with it. And then there's a dissent, which takes issue with all of this and says, no, this is criminalizing a ton of ordinary politics, and we can't be doing that. That would raise serious First Amendment problems. So I found it to be a fascinating case. I think it raises interesting questions about a lot of people's intuitions about what's legitimate in terms of campaign contributions, what promises can candidates make. One of the issues that they say is, what if he had just said on his campaign website, I will vote for every redevelopment project that comes before me, contribute to my campaign. There's a plausible reading of the bribery statutes where accepting that contribution from someone who wants a redevelopment project is a bribe. And that doesn't sound like the sort of thing that Congress was probably trying to criminalize. So there's a lot that we could talk about, but one of the things that I found really interesting and that wasn't raised directly in the opinion was that we have this transcript of this conversation that goes on between Chin and Sittenfeld, which, as you heard, is almost entirely incomprehensible, at least as to what Sittenfeld was explicitly trying to say.
They sounded uncomfortable with what they were talking about. So
yeah, well,
it's hard to tell what he's getting at.
And Sittenfeld, in his own testimony, had said this seemed really out of character for Chin, who had never taken this kind of aggressive sell for me. And there were other times where the FBI, who is involved in this and has like FBI agents pretending to be donors, they try to get Sittenfeld to accept illegal contributions like $10,000 in cash, and he refuses to do it. He says, no, if you want to give to my campaign, you've got to send the money to my PAC. You've got to do it legally. It's got to be attributable to a donor.
He wasn't a Jim trafficant.
No,
taking sacks of cash.
No, there's no, or it was a Jefferson with the cash in the freezer, I think it was. So a very timely reference for me to make there. So there's a lot of evidence that he was trying to walk some kind of line, and only, I think, a little bit of ambiguous evidence that he could have crossed it. But anyway, the thing that I found interesting about the exchange between them, I'm reading this transcript, and because it's a transcript of a spoken conversations don't have punctuation, but the transcript does. And in the transcript where he says, you don't want me to be like, and then quotation mark, hey, Chin, like, love you, but can't, close quotation mark, like, And this was about Chin was saying, I want to give to your campaign, but I can't do it. I've got to get other people to give the money, so is not attributable to me. I'm not certain that the quotation mark closed where this transcript thinks it closed. And so the way it reads in the transcript is, I love you, but I can't do the redevelopment project. But another way you could read it is, hey, Chin, like, love you, but can't you, in a sense saying, can't you, support me openly? Because his very next line is, if a candidate doesn't want people to support them, they're a shitty, dumb candidate. So it seems like a very plausible reading of this is him saying, seems really weird that you want to support me, but you don't want people to know you're supporting me. Can't you, do that openly? Now, I haven't heard the audio recording of that. Maybe that's not borne out in the audio recording, but this is also a very muddled statement. So, you know, Sittenfeld is represented by very talented lawyers at Jones Day. I think it's very likely that they will file a cert petition in this case. And the Supreme Court has taken a number of cases in recent years where they have tried to make a little bit brighter lines around some of these very vague white collar type crimes like honest services fraud and things like that. I don't know if there is a circuit split on any of these issues. But this does seem like the kind of case that has appealed to the Supreme Court in recent years. So I think it's got a pretty good shot. And it's also a case where I think it actually has real implications if this is the state of the law, because it would empower the government to investigate and prosecute lots of politicians for lots of what is frankly perfectly ordinary horse trading. It may seem a little bit unsavory to people, but it's not necessarily the kind of graft and bribery that these laws are aimed at. It's not people taking money for their own personal use to buy like a boat or a lake house. It's people raising money so that they can engage in First Amendment protected activity. And I think we have to be very careful about where we draw the lines around that activity.
Bobbi?
Paul, I not that you didn't do it justice, but when I was reading this case, I did really want to hear the audio because the jury convicted him based on that statement. So I did wonder if they drew some inferences from his tone or his inflection or something that suggested in a way that the written word doesn't, that he actually was trying to induce a bribe. I also found it interesting that two of the men he was speaking to were working with Chin as FBI agents. And I think that in normal politicking, maybe an FBI agent would say something different than a normal donor in a way to get someone to say something that they wouldn't otherwise say. And in a way, I don't think that one conversation or even multiple conversations like this that aren't so clear-cut, explicit quid pro quo type situations should be used to convict someone for something like this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Sittenfeld was sentenced to 16 months in prison on the basis of this rather equivocal statement. Now, I wasn't sitting where the jury was sitting, and one of the differences between the majority opinion and the dissent is this view about, you know, kind of how much trust should we place in the jury. I do think that this is a situation where there are reasons to be particularly cautious, mostly from my background in working on campaign finance cases, because one of the things that I've really realized is that, I mean, no doubt there are unsavory things that happen in politics, but I also think that the view that a lot of people have about the level of corruption involved in campaign contributions is just wildly different from the way that it works in practice. Like, most people give to candidates not because they're trying to get something out of the candidate, but because they want that kind of candidate to be in office, because they think that candidate's philosophy or their platform is going to be consistent with their best interest. And so it's not so much that money tends to drive the political behavior of candidates, it's that money tends to follow candidates who express certain views. And that seems to have been the case here. Developers were giving contributions to the pro-development candidate. But because the views of the public are sort of diametrically opposed to that, they tend to be very suspicious of legitimate political campaigns and contributions. They're likely to read a lot of ill intent where it doesn't actually exist. And the consequence of getting that wrong is that a person who didn't break the law could go to jail for quite a long time.
One thing I didn't understand about that aspect of it, about this being whether he's just a pro-development candidate and so these people want to give him money, these developers, or whether there's some kind of quid pro quo there, is that the opinion doesn't talk at all about an entrapment defense. I know we're not criminal lawyers and are steeped in entrapment and all that. I know most of mine from when I've read about it in Russell of the Bailey, but maybe what I learned in law school. But it seems to me that when Chin at one point was saying, well, it's like 100%, right? Like you take the money and then 100% we get the permit given. And he's doing that, of course, because he's an FBI mole. And so he's trying to get that on the record. And the defendant's kind of like, where's this coming from? He's like, doesn't accede to that.
Yeah, this feels really weird. And he sort of takes the view, like, I can't guarantee 1,000%, but I can tell you, like, I've got the votes on the board, and I'm confident I can get this through.
Yeah, and he just kind of falls back on, I'm pro-development, I've never voted against development, blah, blah, blah. So it seems to me that would be where you'd think entrapment would come up. I know entrapment is a lot harder in practice than it is in theory, but and maybe maybe it was adjudicated in the district court and it just isn't worth it on appeal or whatever. But it really had that feeling, and maybe that's part of what's driving both the concurrence and the dissent, saying this is a really hard case, and if it weren't for the jury, we'd be going that way, but it feels wrong.
Yeah, I mean, even if this doesn't technically rise to the level of entrapment, and I'm not an expert on entrapment, it has that kind of flavor, and I think that's reflected in the facts, where Chin is this guy who actually did break the law, who was caught breaking the law.
Yeah, he has an incentive to set this guy up.
And instead of punishing him, the government says, you know what, we'll let you off the hook if you let us use you to catch other criminals. And when that happens, you often get in situations like this where people who would never have actually broken the law, if Sittenfeld even did break the law, kind of the FBI is like actively pushing them over the line. I mean, I think you see this all the time, for example, with certain terrorism prosecutions, where people who are just kind of like, young, angry people get on internet message boards. They're not actually particularly dangerous. And there's some FBI handler who's like, talks to them for months and just works actively to get them riled up, and then says, hey, meet me in this parking lot. And then they get arrested, when if that FBI handler hadn't been on the message board, none of this ever would have gotten to that point.
Right.
And this, to me, feels very much like the same kind of thing. These were people looking to make a crime happen. And arguably, they didn't even achieve that, but it doesn't seem like the best use of law enforcement resources.
One last thing, there's this I don't get the technicalities because I don't know this area of law, but there's this line that they had to prove an explicit but not express quid pro quo. And then Judge Murphy in the concurrence is like, what the heck does that mean? What is that difference? I'm sure the jury doesn't realize what that difference is. And it's kind of like screaming out, Supreme Court, please clean up the case law in this area, because that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So, an explicit quid pro quo would be, I will not vote for your redevelopment project unless you give me this campaign contribution. An express quid pro quo would be where we share that understanding, but it is communicated without those exact words, with kind of a wink and a nod. Like, look, I can help you. It kind of like, this is a nice store you have. Be ashamed if something happened to it. That may communicate and express understanding, and it's kind of up to the jury to decide if it did. But boy, like with a statement like this, the whole love you but can't, there's a ton of room for ambiguity.
Right.
And I think very innocent potential explanations. But again, I wasn't in the courtroom. I didn't hear the recording, but from the transcript alone, I mean, and the other thing is, in the First Amendment context, the courts are far less tolerant of vagueness around what is and is not legal than they are in potentially other contexts, because when you have blurry lines around what is and is not acceptable speech, people tend to speak a lot less because they want to stay way away from the line. And we don't want to lose that speech that exists between where the line is and where people are afraid it might be. So the Supreme Court has typically been very insistent that the lines be bright so that people can come right up to the line and know that they're there without crossing over it.
Well, speaking of lines, a line that is not bright is what is a search? Something we've talked about on this show many times, and it seems to only get murkier. So, Bobbi, tell us about these police officers in Waterbury, Connecticut, who for some reason used their iPhones, and that was not a search.
Right. So this is United States versus Polar, recently decided case out of the Second Circuit. And like you said, Anthony, this case deals a lot with something that we see at IJ, which is what is a search for purposes of the Fourth Amendment. So Polar was convicted of several federal drug crimes, and he pled guilty to a lesser sentence on the condition that he could challenge this suppression motion on appeal for evidence that was found inside of his car. So here he is. So this stems from events that took place on May 3rd of 2022. Police officers had been watching Polar's residence for some time. He was wanted as part of a narcotics and weapons investigation, and he also had a state warrant for parole violation. So they'd been watching him for a while. They watch him drive up to the street where his residence is, park a gray Acura, and some individuals came up to the car. They exchanged some items by hand. The individuals left. Polar went into his residence. And the police, based on their experience and training, say, I think we just witnessed a drug deal. Now's the time. So some of the officers go into the home to execute the warrant. The rest of them stay behind and focus on the Acura. And this case deals with what happens at the Acura. So they don't have a warrant for the car. The windows are tinted. And the officers go to the front windows on either side of the car, and they use their iPhone cameras to actually aid them to see beyond the window tint inside the car. And did either of you know that an iPhone camera could allow you to do that? Because prior to reading this case, I did not know that.
So I didn't know about that, but I did, as probably a lot of our listeners and viewers know, when we had the Aurora Borealis last summer or fall, whenever that was, people could use their phones to see it, even if you couldn't see it with your naked eye. So that I learned from that there was a comet also a few months ago that you could do the same thing. Those phone cameras are like crazy. They can see, they're like super eyes, see all kinds of things.
So yeah, the iPhone camera will allow you to see past window tint. And I looked at the district court opinion if you could see what time of day this was, because I wasn't sure if it was the phone or the flashlight or some combination of the two, but it was 8:17 in the morning, which is, a great time for a drug deal. But you can, it's bright as day, and you can see the phone up against the window, and it allows you to see right past the tint, which I thought was interesting. So when they look through the tinted window, they see a bag of drugs and what looks like 2 firearms. They talk about another officer going around to the front of the car and kind of cupping his hands to see through the front windshield, which obviously isn't tinted. And he says, hey, I see what looks like some guns and a bag of drugs. So they tow the car, they search the car, they find a narcotics/fentanyl substance and 2 firearms. And they charge Polar with drug trafficking and use of a firearm while drug trafficking. And again, he pleads guilty to a lesser sentence on the condition that he can challenge the district court's denial of the motion to suppress the evidence found in his car. He argues 2 things on appeal. First, he says the officers using their iPhone cameras to see inside of his car violated his reasonable expectation of privacy, and so therefore that's a search. He also says that the officers leaning up against the car or leaning their phones against the car constituted a physical intrusion into a constitutionally protected area. So he's got 2 theories as to what makes this conduct a search. So the first inquiry is whether or not this is a search, because if it's not, there's no Fourth Amendment inquiry to be had. So there's 2 ways that this conduct could be a search. The first way is that it could violate a reasonable expectation of privacy. And the second is that the officers can physically intrude on a constitutionally protected area. So first, the court goes through the reasonable expectation of privacy. And this is a two-part inquiry from United States versus Katz. And it's basically, does the person, in this case, does Poehler himself, have a subjective expectation of privacy? And then if so, is that expectation one that society is objectively prepared to recognize as reasonable? So it's a two-part inquiry. As a threshold matter, the court says that mere visual observation of something through a window is not a search. What a person knowingly exposes to the public can't be the subject of a search, even in your own home. That's the plain view doctrine. And it talks about cases where this even holds true when an officer goes up to a car and shines a flashlight in the window, or an officer goes up to a bag and shines a flashlight in the bag. If the officer needs a flashlight, the items that are seen by the flashlight are not taken out of that plain view doctrine. Officers are not required to, as the court says, shield their eyes to illegal evidence in plain view. But then Poehler says, what about my tinted windows? I've tinted my car windows, so I've established for myself a reasonable expectation of privacy, because you don't do that unless you want people to not be able to see what's in your car. It's an interesting argument, but the court really doesn't buy it. They say two things. First, they say Connecticut law only allows you to tint your windows so much. And what's legally permitted by law is still allowing some light to get through, some vision to get through, so you can't possibly have an expectation that nothing will be seen. And then the court says you can take all the precautions you want, really, but if your precautionary measures still make your items visible to what they call snoops or diligent police officers, you have no reasonable expectation of privacy. And it talks about a case, California versus Serralo, where the court said you can build a 10-foot fence around your home, but the items inside could still be visible to a passenger on a double-decker bus.
I thought that was wacky to me. Like, I understand how that's consistent with the doctrine, but I think a lot of people would be shocked by that.
And I think that says something about the doctrine. But yes, I found that interesting. So using that logic, it's hard to imagine what you could do to signal your reasonable expectation of privacy. But so long as someone or anyone could make an observation about what's inside of your car, you don't have any reasonable expectation of privacy in it. So that could have been the end of the inquiry, because he has no reasonable expectation of privacy. But the court also goes on to analyze the use of the iPhone under Kylo. So Kylo is a 2001 Supreme Court case where officers were outside of a home and they used infrared technology for the purposes of determining what kind of heat was inside the home. And the Supreme Court basically said that that's a search because two reasons. One, it's technology that is not in general public use, and it's also a method of searching that you could not do absent a physical intrusion.
Wasn't in 2001, at least.
Well, no, it wasn't in 2001.
Now.
And so Poehler looks at the facts of Kylo and says, that should apply to me too, because the general public use of iPhones is not to go up to cars with tinted windows and look into them. So in the same way the police were using the infrared technology in Kylo, they were using their iPhones here, and that should constitute a search. And what the district court did, the District of Connecticut, what they did is they said Kylo stood for the proposition that if technology is widely available and used by the general public, then its use by the police can't constitute a search. And the Second Circuit says that's kind of too broad of a reading of that case. And we're not going to read that case so broadly, because they could envision some circumstances where use of technology that is available to the greater public in a very intrusive manner, such as in the home, could constitute a search. The Second Circuit doesn't want to extend the reasoning of Kylo in this case beyond the home to the vehicle, but they could envision some technology that is in the general public use. Think of ring door cameras. They mention like smart meters. If that technology is used in a particularly intrusive way by police, it could still constitute a search. They also say that that's not really necessary here because they've already decided that Poehler had no reasonable expectation of privacy. So although they kind of limit the district court's reading of Kylo, they say we don't even really need to apply it here because whether the police use the iPhone camera in a manner consistent with public use or not, you don't have any reasonable expectation of what's in your car, even if you do tint your windows.
Plus the one cop, right, did the cupping thing.
Right. And that's kind of the second, less important, but also analyzed claim is the physical intrusion. So the cops leaning against the car, cupping their hands, looking inside, they dispense with that pretty quickly because they say, first of all, there's no evidence that anyone did actually lean against the car. And in the picture I mentioned in the district court's opinion, you can see the phone next to the window, but you can't really tell if it's touching the window or not. You also don't need to touch the windshield to see in it. And then also the court says even if the cops did lean up against the windshield, that wasn't the but-for cause of the discovery of the evidence. The but-for cause of the discovery of the evidence was the use of the iPhone to see through the tint. And since they've already determined that that was not a search, they don't need to really analyze the physical intrusion part. And the interesting takeaway for me was, first of all, that the Second Circuit doesn't want to extend the reading of Kylo to outside the home. I thought that was interesting. And it wasn't so much about the technology as much as where that technology was aimed. They talk a lot about how the home is kind of at the core Fourth Amendment protection, cars not so much. At one point, Poehler argues, well, people live in their cars, and they kind of dispense with that quickly and say, you don't, so we don't really need to talk about that here. But I just found that part of the case very interesting.
Yeah, Kylo was a favorite of mine when I was taking criminal procedure in law school. For those who haven't read it, it's written by Justice Scalia, and it has some nice turns of phrase. He talks about, kind of the sanctity of the home and how intrusive it would be to see the heat signatures coming off of the home because it might reveal like when the lady of the house takes her bath or something like that.
That's right.
But I do think this long footnote from the court where they talk about how we don't want to foreclose this idea either as to technology that becomes widely available or things being applied outside the home. I think it's very valuable. I'm glad that the court is sensitive to that because we just have no concept of what's going to be available. And I think about some of the technological changes we've seen in recent years. One of the things that I think is going to continue to raise a lot of Fourth Amendment issues, for example, is the use of drone photography. Let's say you make walls that are 100 feet high and the police start flying drones over your property. Like, is there anything that you can do that would not be too intrusive for the police? I mean, it seems outlandish, but like, what if this is something that I'm sure Anthony knows all about, the Herculaneum scrolls that now they're able to decipher. These are very exciting. These are ancient scrolls that have been like carbonized and buried for thousands of years. They were impossible to read. Now we can scan them with MRIs and digitally unroll them and read them and decipher them. What if there were some kind of technology that would allow you to read the words in a sealed envelope that is sitting on someone's dashboard? I mean, I think most people would feel they have a legitimate expectation of privacy in that. And if that technology became ubiquitous, I would be very concerned about the police using it to read people's private correspondence.
Well, and there's also the manner, like, when does technology become ubiquitous? 10 years ago, not everybody had an iPhone. And as Anthony mentioned, infrared might not have been available in 2001, but it's more widely available in later years. The court talks about mapping cameras. And so drawing such a bright line between available, not available, makes it difficult, especially with the speed of technology becoming available, to actually determine where each use of technology falls on that line.
And we don't today have a member of our Fourth Amendment project at IJ, at least one of a couple leaders of the project. But I will speak on their behalf by saying I think a lot of this just shows how confused Fourth Amendment doctrine is when it comes to what a search is, and how there is a better way. A kind of a better way has been shown by this physical intrusion technique, which comes from this case called Jones from about a dozen years ago, that has been at least clarifying, but it hasn't led to all that much change, I have to say, in Fourth Amendment doctrine. I mean, our position at IJ is to look more at a search as an investigative act by the government, and if it's a search, it's a search, and then we can deal with whether it's a reasonable search and you should have been able to get a warrant and all that stuff. It seems this is another example, I think, where courts are just want to shut everything down at the search level instead of getting into how the Fourth Amendment, operationalizes what is a legitimate search or not. And the whole cat's test of reasonable expectation of privacy has just made such a mess of that. I did think it was interesting how the court looked at Connecticut law about tinted windows, which is a little bit of the whole positive law doctrine that a few scholars have written about in recent years. And we had a panel about it at our Open Fields conference last year that I had the pleasure of moderating, where you look at how you define what is reasonable or what is a search under the Fourth Amendment. I'm kind of butchering it there, I'm sure, is what would the law be for a normal person, and then the police can do that, but if they go beyond that, then it has Fourth Amendment implications. And I don't think they cited to any of that stuff, but you could see that was maybe going on and in the background there. I also liked how you can always tell maybe where a court is not quite sure about what it's doing by the number of footnotes. And man, there are some monster footnotes in this opinion. So if you're a fan of footnotes, go check it out, and maybe you could see where the courts are confused. And this is another. I think what was true with the first case. This is another case that would be nice to go up to the Supreme Court, where we're still waiting. We've talked about this in recent episodes. Still waiting for it to clarify some of this Fourth Amendment, what's a search stuff. And this is a case where it might actually make a difference. Although I have to say, they had the police here had a warrant for his arrest. They had a warrant to search his house. They just didn't have like the dinky warrant to search this car, and yet that's how they convict him and what the case is all about. Which
there's
you guys
also
have thoughts on that?
I wonder if it was his car. That was my only. It didn't really say that it was his car.
To me, it's just evidence of like the fundamental Fourth Amendment rule that we all learn in criminal procedure, which is that if you are in a car, you are screwed, because you're just out of luck. Because essentially, historically, what happened was in the Prohibition era, suddenly we were enforcing these laws where people were moving around this evidence of crimes in these newly available technologies. And if you had to wait to get a warrant to search the car, they would drive away and they would destroy the evidence. And so they invented this thing called the automobile exception. And of course, you're driving around in this vehicle that has windows, and you're often stopping people on the side of a busy road where we're concerned about officer safety. And so the law has just gradually moved in this direction where if you're anywhere close to a car, you're basically out of luck, except in the case where the police covertly attach a GPS tracking device to your car, then you win, but that's only because they have trespassed on your car.
Right. That's
also
the Jones case.
when they chalk your tires. Anthony, you mentioned footnotes.
We did. There were a couple of those cases a couple of years ago.
There's a footnote in this case about the split around the Jones doctrine and when is it an intrusion and when it's not. And the Sixth Circuit actually said that chalking the tire for the purposes of figuring out the movements of the car is a search. And when I saw that, I thought, well, that seems a little bit less intrusive than this, but it's murky. It's murky.
Yeah, I think the Ninth Circuit went the other way. I think that was maybe we did both cases, but
that's putting like a mark with a piece of chalk on the tire so that you can identify it. I'd
take that over the GPS device, but What do I know? Well, I know that our guests today have had brilliant exposés of what these courts are up to and analysis. So thank you both, Bobbi and Paul, and thank you for listening or watching. Please be sure to follow Short Circuit on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other podcast platforms. And in the meantime, we ask you to get engaged.